Think you know Native American history? Tipis, peace pipes, and vanishing tribes? Yeah, you've been lied to. Here are 5 myths about Native Americans that you probably still believe. Number 1. Native Americans were a single, unified culture. Let's get this straight. Saying Native Americans as if they were one giant, homogeneous tribe is like calling all Europeans Europeans and assuming the French, Vikings, and Greeks all lived in the same village eating croissants and swinging battle axes. Truth? They were over 500 distinct nations, with unique languages, customs, governments, and even rivalries. Before Columbus ever sailed anywhere near the Americas, there were hundreds of sovereign indigenous nations across the continent. We're talking about everything from the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast, with its sophisticated democratic system, yes, a democracy before the U.S. Constitution, to the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, who built multi-story cities into the cliffs. From the Lakota on the Great Plains mastering horseback warfare, to the Pacific Northwest tribes carving totem poles and building canoes that could take on open waters. They spoke over 300 languages. They had alliances, rivalries, and trade routes that crisscrossed the continent. Some nations had matriarchal leadership, others didn't. Some were hunter-gatherers, others farmed corn, beans, and squash like agricultural bosses. Some even had massive cities. There were shared beliefs and values across some nations, like respect for nature and ancestry. But no single religion, no one leader, and definitely no pan-Indian identity. That idea came much later, mostly from outsiders trying to simplify the complex reality. Number 2. Native Americans lived only in tipis and roamed as nomads. Let's blame Hollywood for this one. For decades, Westerns gave us the same tired image: a lone teepee on a dusty plain, a feathered warrior on horseback, and tumbleweeds rolling by. Dramatic, sure. Accurate for every native group? Not even close. The truth is, the teepee was specific to certain plains tribes, like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche, who did lead more mobile lifestyles, especially after horses were introduced. And even then, the teepee wasn't just a tent. It was a genius piece of engineering. Portable, weatherproof, and designed with smoke vents so you could roast a bison and survive winter. But for most indigenous peoples, teepees weren't even on the menu. If you lived among the Iroquois in the Northeast, home was a longhouse, a massive wooden structure that could house entire extended families like a giant cozy Airbnb. In the Southwest, the Hopi and Zuni built pueblos, multi-storied stone and adobe buildings that looked like something out of an architecture magazine. The Cherokee in the Southeast had wattle and daub houses made with woven branches and clay. In Alaska, the Inuit used sod houses for winter, and yes, occasionally igloos. But spoiler, they weren't living in them year-round. And here's the part they definitely left out of your school textbook: Cahokia. Located near modern-day St. Louis, Cahokia was a massive indigenous city that peaked around the 11th century, way before Columbus even got lost. At its height, it had a population of over 20,000 people, making it larger than London at the time. It had sprawling neighborhoods, ceremonial plazas, and massive earthen pyramids, like Monk's Mound, which is still there today. Not bad for a primitive people, huh? Some tribes did move with the seasons, especially those following buffalo migrations or shifting agricultural cycles. But many indigenous nations built permanent cities, some with roads, irrigation systems, and entire urban layouts. So no, not everyone was chasing herds across the plains in animal skin tents. Most Native Americans were settled, strategic, and had housing plans that would make modern urban planners cry with envy. Number 3. Native Americans didn't develop advanced technology. The idea that Native Americans were somehow primitive is one of the most stubborn and frankly outdated myths out there. They didn't have steel swords or wheels on carts, but they had innovation, engineering, and science tailored perfectly to their environment. Let's talk architecture. Ever heard of the Pueblo cliff dwellings in the Southwest? These weren't tents. They were multi-story buildings carved into canyon walls, complete with ventilation systems, water management, and stone masonry that's still standing centuries later. Or how about agriculture? Tribes like the Iroquois developed highly productive farming techniques, like the Three Sisters method, where corn, beans, and squash were planted together to support and nourish each other. That's symbiotic farming long before anyone coined the term. And don't forget the Mississippian cultures, who built complex urban centers like Cahokia and his famous mound. These weren't just piles of dirt. The biggest one, Monk's Mound, stands over 30 meters high, covers 14 acres, and took millions of hand-carried baskets of soil to construct. And they didn't just pile it up randomly. The layers were engineered with different soil types to manage drainage, stability, and even earthquake resistance. That's right, ancient North American seismic proofing. Some mounds were aligned with celestial events, showing a deep understanding of astronomy and geometry. These weren't huts and hills. They were precision-built monuments that required planning, labor coordination, and architectural know-how. Without blueprints or bulldozers, they tracked the stars, mapped the land, tanned hides into waterproof clothing, developed complex sign languages across tribes, and crafted tools from bone, obsidian, and even copper. So just because their tech didn't beep or come with an instruction manual doesn't mean it wasn't genius. Number 4. Native Americans didn't own land and were fine with Europeans taking it. The idea that native peoples casually handed over land because they didn't believe in ownership? Total nonsense. And a convenient excuse for colonizers. Yes, many indigenous nations didn't view land as something you could buy and sell like livestock. But that doesn't mean they didn't have a concept of territorial rights. Quite the opposite. Tribes had sacred ties to specific landscapes, rivers, hunting grounds, and mountain ranges. Their stories, ancestors, and spirituality were literally rooted in the soil. You weren't just living on the land, you were part of it. So no, they didn't think anyone could own the earth any more than you could own the sky or the wind. But they absolutely knew when someone was trespassing or trying to take what wasn't theirs. The Powhatan Confederacy, for example, was a powerful alliance of over 30 tribes in what's now Virginia. When the English landed in Jamestown, they didn't find a cultural vacuum. They entered a highly organized political system with leaders, laws, and boundaries. And when it became clear the newcomers weren't leaving, conflict broke out. This wasn't a peaceful handoff. It was a protracted struggle over land, resources, and survival. And let's not forget the Cherokee. These weren't isolated forest dwellers. They were building schools, running newspapers in Cherokee, and creating a written constitution modeled on the U.S. one. They tried everything to protect their land through diplomacy and the legal system. In fact, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor in 1832. Did that stop the U.S. government? Nope. President Andrew Jackson basically said, "Cool story, bro," and pushed through the Trail of Tears, forcibly removing thousands from their ancestral land in one of the most brutal displacements in American history. Yeah, the English colonists weren't exactly saints, to say the least. They even resorted to a downright terrifying tactic to drive out the First Nations, the smallpox blanket story, the one that sounds too dark to be true, but horrifyingly is. During Pontiac's War in the 1760s, British military officers discussed infecting native populations by giving them blankets used by smallpox patients. There's even a letter between Amherst and Colonel Henry Bouquet proposing it. "We must use every stratagem in our power," Amherst wrote. In other words, biological warfare. So no, they didn't just give their territories away. They were misled, betrayed, and attacked. Their views on land may have been different, but their understanding of justice, protection, and sovereignty was crystal clear. They didn't lose the land. It was taken often with fire, steel, and smallpox. Number 5. The French were the friendly colonizers. Let's set the scene. You've got English colonists showing up like it's their backyard barbecue. Guns out, fences up, and zero chill. The Spanish? They brought the Inquisition and a healthy dose of conquest. And then there's the French, walking in with fur hats, wine, and bonjour, like they just wanted to vibe and trade beaver pelts. Sounds cozy, right? Well, kinda. The French did tend to approach indigenous nations with more diplomacy than their European peers. They formed strong alliances, notably with the Huron and Algonquin, and often relied on native trade networks and military support rather than brute force. In fact, French survival in early Canada heavily depended on indigenous knowledge and cooperation. So yes, less musket, more merci. But let's not get carried away with the baguette and beret fantasy. The French were still colonizers, and they came with empire-sized ambitions. They laid claim to vast territories that were already occupied, introduced European diseases like smallpox and measles, and imposed Catholic missions that tried to reshape indigenous spiritual and social life. And sure, they handed out beads instead of bullets more often than the English, but those beads came with strings attached. Take the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. On the surface, it looked like a big diplomatic win, and in some ways it was. Over 40 indigenous nations and the French came together to end decades of conflict, which was rare for the time. But the treaty also helped France tighten its control, weaken certain native alliances, and paint itself as the friendly power, while still pulling the strings behind the scenes. And remember, even Jesuit missionaries, who often get framed as scholarly, peaceful types, were actively working to convert indigenous people, sometimes by dismantling traditional beliefs. The French might have brought champagne instead of cannons, but they still came for the land, not for friendship bracelets. Which civilization should we bust myths about next? Drop your pick in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss it when it comes to life.